The cruelest exile is not being sent away. It is being told you were never enough to belong. Snow drifted silently through the open courtyard of Mooncrest Palace, covering the ancient stone steps with a fragile layer of white that seemed almost too beautiful for the sorrow unfolding beneath the grey winter sky. Olivia Bennet stood perfectly still in the center of the royal hall, her gloved hands folded quietly before her as dozens of nobles, advisors, and pack elders watched without speaking. The roaring fireplace along the marble wall filled the chamber with warmth, yet none of it seemed able to reach the cold gathering inside her heart. She had stood beside the Alpha King for 6 years, honoring every promise she had ever made. She had comforted grieving families after harsh winters, organized harvest festivals for orphaned children, prepared meals for injured warriors returning home, and quietly carried the burdens expected of a queen without ever asking for recognition. Yet today, none of those memories appeared to matter. The royal physician slowly lowered his eyes before stepping away from the center of the room. His silence carried more weight than any speech could have. Olivia already understood what was coming. She had known from the moment she entered the palace that morning and found every face avoiding hers. At the far end of the hall, the Alpha King remained standing before the throne beneath the silver crest of the kingdom. Adrian Blackwood wore a formal black coat trimmed with dark fur, his broad shoulders perfectly straight, his silver eyes unreadable despite the emotion buried deep within them. He looked every inch the ruler his people admired. Only Olivia noticed the faint tightening of his jaw, the almost invisible hesitation before he finally spoke. "The physician has confirmed the council's findings," Adrian said, his deep voice steady enough to echo through the silent chamber. "There will be no royal heir from this union." The words floated across the room like snow carried by an icy wind. No one gasped. No one protested. Several council members simply lowered their heads as though the decision had already been accepted long before Olivia entered the hall. She looked from one familiar face to another, recognizing people she had celebrated holidays with, laughed beside during summer festivals, and comforted through seasons of hardship. Now every pair of eyes seemed fixed somewhere beyond her, unwilling to meet her gaze. Olivia inhaled slowly, refusing to let her hands tremble. She had learned years ago that dignity often survived only through silence. Adrian reached toward the small velvet box resting upon the carved wooden table beside him. Inside lay the silver ring that had once marked her place beside the throne. He lifted it carefully, not with anger or contempt, but with the quiet sorrow of a man obeying expectations heavier than his own heart. When Olivia stepped forward, she removed the ring herself before he ever needed to ask. The polished silver caught the pale winter light one final time before she gently placed it into his waiting hand. Their fingers brushed for only an instant. Neither of them looked away. Around them, the kingdom held its breath. Adrian closed his hand around the ring, his expression remaining composed despite the unmistakable sadness lingering behind his eyes. Then, with the calm voice of a king placing duty above love, he spoke the words that would follow Olivia long after she crossed the palace gates. "You are free." No chains had ever touched her wrists, yet in that single moment she felt the weight of an entire life quietly fall away like snow melting from forgotten branches. Olivia did not remember walking out of the royal hall. She only remembered the sound of the enormous oak doors closing behind her with a slow, echoing weight that seemed to separate one lifetime from the next. Snowflakes drifted gently across the palace courtyard, settling on her pale wool cloak before quietly melting against the warmth she still carried from inside. The silver ring that had rested on her hand for 6 years was gone, leaving behind nothing more than a faint circle on her finger, a small reminder that some promises could disappear without leaving a visible scar. Palace servants stood beneath the stone archways, pretending to busy themselves with lanterns and wagons. A few glanced toward her before lowering their eyes. Others remained completely still, unwilling to acknowledge the woman who had once greeted them every morning with a kind smile and remembered the names of their children. Olivia held no anger toward them. Fear often made good people silent. She climbed into the modest carriage prepared for her departure. There were no royal banners, no farewell procession, and no farewell speech. Only a single trunk containing a few dresses, several books, her mother's worn quilt, and a small wooden music box she had treasured since childhood. Across the courtyard, the palace windows reflected the gray winter sky. For a brief moment, she wondered whether Adrian was still standing inside the great hall, holding the silver ring she had returned only minutes earlier. She closed her eyes before the thought could grow heavier. Some questions belonged to the past the moment they were asked. The horses began moving, their steady footsteps crunching softly across the snow-covered road leading away from Mooncrest Palace. Olivia watched familiar towers slowly disappear behind falling snow. Every turn of the carriage wheels carried her farther from the only home she had known as an adult. Villages passed quietly beyond the frosted windows. Children laughed while building snowmen beside wooden fences. Families carried baskets of firewood toward warm cottages where evening meals already scented the cold air with roasted vegetables and fresh bread. Ordinary life continued without pause, untouched by the sorrow riding silently inside the small carriage. As daylight slowly faded, the driver stopped beside a quiet crossroads to allow the horses a short rest. Olivia stepped outside, wrapping her cloak more tightly around herself as icy wind swept across the open fields. A weathered wooden sign pointed north toward unfamiliar land she had never visited. South led back to the kingdom that no longer claimed her. She stared at both directions for a long moment before quietly turning toward the northern road. There was nothing waiting behind her except memories that had already been folded away like winter clothes at the end of a season. The driver approached respectfully. "My lady," he asked gently, "where would you like me to take you?" Olivia looked toward the distant mountains where the last rays of sunlight painted the snowy peaks with soft shades of gold and rose. She realized she had no destination, no invitation, and no certainty about what tomorrow would bring. Yet for the first time all day, she also realized something else. No council remained to judge her worth. No throne remained to define her future. The road ahead was frightening because it was unknown, but it also belonged entirely to her now. She offered the driver a quiet, grateful smile. "Take the northern road," she said softly. "Somewhere beyond these mountains, there must still be a place where a person is welcomed for the heart they carry instead of the child they cannot give." The driver nodded without another question, climbed back onto the carriage seat, and gently guided the horses forward as the snow continued falling around them, covering the tracks leading back toward the kingdom that had chosen to let her go. The northern road grew narrower with every passing mile, winding through snow-covered forests where towering pine trees carried heavy blankets of white across their branches. The little carriage moved slowly over the frozen trail, its wooden wheels crunching softly through fresh snow while pale winter sunlight filtered between the trees in long golden ribbons. Olivia sat quietly beneath her wool blanket, watching the unfamiliar landscape drift past the frosted window. She no longer counted the distance separating her from Mooncrest Palace. Instead, she counted small blessings that still remained. The gentle driver who never asked unnecessary questions. The warmth of her mother's old quilt folded beside her. The quiet freedom to choose each mile ahead for herself. By late afternoon the snowfall became heavier, forcing the carriage to slow even more. The driver finally guided the horses toward a small roadside shelter built from rough timber where weary travelers often stopped during harsh weather. "We should rest for a little while," he said kindly. "The horses need water, and another storm is moving through the valley." Olivia thanked him and stepped carefully into the crisp winter air. The silence surrounding the forest felt almost sacred. No palace bells echoed through the mountains. No council voices whispered behind carved doors. Only the distant song of a mountain stream hidden beneath sheets of ice broke the stillness. She pulled her cloak tighter and began gathering small fallen branches near the shelter to help the driver build a fire. As she bent to lift another piece of dry wood, a faint sound drifted through the wind. It was not an animal. It sounded more like a child trying very hard not to cry. Olivia stopped immediately. She listened again. The sound came from beyond a cluster of snow-covered evergreens near the edge of the road. Without hesitation she walked carefully toward it, her boots sinking several inches into fresh snow. Behind the trees she discovered a little boy no older than 8 sitting beside an overturned handcart. His cheeks were bright red from the cold, and his mittens were soaked with melting snow. Beside him sat an elderly woman wrapped in a faded blue shawl, breathing slowly while trying to calm the frightened child with a gentle smile. Their basket of bread and blankets had spilled across the snowy ground. "Are you all right?" Olivia asked softly as she knelt beside them. The woman smiled apologetically. "The wheel broke," she explained. "We thought we could make it to the next village before the storm." Olivia looked toward the damaged cart. One wooden wheel had slipped completely off its axle. The little boy lowered his eyes. "Grandmother said we should keep walking, but she is tired." Olivia did not think about the long journey still waiting ahead. She simply removed her own thick wool blanket from the carriage and carefully wrapped it around the elderly woman's shoulders. Then she gathered every loaf of bread and folded every blanket back into the cart before asking the driver whether he carried spare rope and simple tools. Together they secured the loose wheel well enough to continue traveling slowly. When the small fire was ready, Olivia poured the last of her hot tea into a tin cup and placed it into the older woman's trembling hands. The child looked at her with wide grateful eyes. "Why are you helping us?" he whispered. Olivia paused for a moment before smiling gently. "Because winter does not ask who deserves kindness before it brings the snow." Neither the boy nor his grandmother realized they had just been helped by a woman who had lost everything only one day before, and as the wind carried fresh snow across the quiet northern road, Olivia quietly discovered that compassion still lived inside her heart even after her own world had fallen apart. The storm finally began to ease as the last pale light of afternoon stretched across the snow-covered valley, leaving the world wrapped in a peaceful silence that seemed almost unreal after hours of relentless wind. Olivia stood beside the repaired handcart, brushing snow from her gloves while the elderly woman gently squeezed her hands with quiet gratitude. "I wish I had something worthy enough to repay you," the older woman said softly, her weathered face warmed by the small fire still glowing beside the roadside shelter. Olivia smiled with genuine kindness. "You already have. You reminded me that even when life changes overnight, people can still choose goodness." The little boy reached into his coat pocket and carefully pulled out a tiny carved wooden bird no bigger than the palm of his hand. "Grandfather made this before he passed away," he said shyly. "I want you to have it because you helped my grandmother." Olivia hesitated, touched by the sincerity in his voice. She gently accepted the small carving and ran her fingers across the smooth polished wood. "I will treasure it," she whispered. The elderly woman watched her thoughtfully for several moments before speaking again. "You are traveling north, are you not?" Olivia nodded. "I do not know exactly where I belong anymore. I only know there is nothing waiting for me behind me." The older woman smiled, as though she had been expecting that answer all along. "Then perhaps the road itself has already chosen your destination." She lifted one trembling hand and pointed toward the distant mountains, where the fading sunlight painted snowy peaks with soft shades of gold. "Beyond those ridges lies the kingdom of Northvale." Olivia quietly repeated the unfamiliar name. "Northvale." The woman nodded. "People there care more about the kindness someone gives than the legacy they inherit. A person's heart carries greater value than a family title, wealth, or the children they may one day have." Olivia lowered her eyes, feeling those words settle gently into the places inside her that still ached from yesterday's farewell. She had spent years believing her worth depended upon something her body could never promise. Hearing someone speak so naturally about a different way of measuring a person's value almost felt impossible. "Have you been there?" she asked. "Many years ago," the woman answered with a peaceful smile. "My daughter built a life there after losing everything during another harsh winter. The people welcomed her before they ever asked where she came from." The little boy looked up excitedly. "They have the best harvest festival every fall," he added. "Everyone eats together. Nobody sits alone." Olivia felt something unfamiliar stirring quietly beneath the weight of her sorrow. It was not happiness. Not yet. It was hope, small and fragile, like the first green leaf pushing through frozen ground after a long winter. The driver finished securing the horses and approached with a respectful smile. "The road is clear enough to continue if you are ready." Olivia looked once more toward the northern mountains. For the first time since leaving the palace, she no longer saw endless uncertainty stretching ahead. She saw the possibility of belonging somewhere she had never imagined. As the carriage rolled forward once again, the elderly woman raised her hand in farewell and called after her with a voice carried gently by the cold evening air. "Do not be afraid of the places that choose you after others have turned away." Olivia held the tiny wooden bird in her hands as the mountain road curved north beneath a sky filled with quiet stars, never realizing that beyond those snow-covered peaks waited a kingdom that would never ask the question that had once cost her everything. By the time the first rays of morning sunlight reached the mountain peaks, the endless forest slowly gave way to wide open valleys covered with fresh snow that sparkled like scattered diamonds beneath the clear winter sky. Olivia lifted the small curtain beside the carriage window and caught her first glimpse of Northvale. Nestled between gentle hills and evergreen forests, the kingdom looked nothing like Mooncrest. There were no towering fortress walls meant to intimidate strangers. Instead, stone cottages with smoking chimneys surrounded a bustling town square where children laughed while pulling wooden sleds through the snow and merchants greeted one another with warm smiles before opening their shops. Even from a distance, the place seemed to breathe with quiet life instead of rigid ceremony. The carriage crossed an old stone bridge spanning a narrow river where clear water continued flowing despite the cold. A carved wooden sign welcomed travelers with simple words burned into the polished timber. "Welcome to Northvale. May every weary traveler find warmth before judgment." Olivia read the sentence twice, almost afraid she had misunderstood it. The driver noticed her expression and smiled gently. "I have driven many roads," he said. "Very few places greet strangers like this." As they approached the northern gate, two guards wearing deep green winter cloaks stepped forward. Their uniforms were neat but practical, and both men carried friendly expressions rather than suspicion. One guard offered a respectful nod before speaking. "Good morning. I hope your journey was safe." Olivia instinctively prepared herself for the questions she had grown accustomed to hearing. "Who are you? Where do you come from? Why have you arrived?" Instead, the second guard glanced toward the snow covering the carriage roof and smiled kindly. "You both must be cold after traveling through the mountains. There is hot soup waiting in the traveler's hall if you would like to rest before continuing." Olivia blinked in surprise. "You are not going to ask who I am?" she asked quietly. The older guard looked genuinely puzzled for a moment before answering with a soft laugh. "Eventually, perhaps. But hungry travelers make poor conversations." His companion nodded in agreement. Everyone deserves a warm meal before answering difficult questions. Olivia felt an unexpected tightness in her throat. Such simple words should not have carried so much meaning, yet after everything she had endured, they settled inside her heart like sunlight after a long storm. The carriage rolled through the open gates and entered streets lined with evergreen garlands, handmade lanterns, and shop windows displaying fresh bread, knitted scarves, carved toys, and steaming mugs of cider. People smiled as they passed, offering polite greetings without staring or whispering. No curious eyes lingered on her face. No one seemed interested in measuring whether she belonged. When the carriage stopped outside the welcoming hall, a gray-haired woman wearing a flour-dusted apron opened the front door before anyone had even knocked. The comforting aroma of vegetable soup, fresh bread, herbs, and cinnamon drifted into the cold morning air. "Come inside," she called warmly. "Breakfast is almost ready." Olivia stepped down from the carriage, clutching the tiny wooden bird in one hand as snowflakes landed softly on her cloak. She looked around the unfamiliar town one more time, realizing that for the first time since leaving the palace, she no longer felt like someone wandering without purpose. She felt like a weary traveler who had simply been invited to sit beside a warm fire, and somehow that quiet welcome carried more healing than every royal promise she had ever been given. The welcoming hall quickly became part of Olivia's daily rhythm, though she had never expected to remain in Northvale longer than a few nights. Each morning before sunrise, she quietly tied on a simple linen apron and joined the volunteers already busy preparing breakfast for travelers, elderly neighbors, and families struggling through the long winter. Steam rose from large iron pots filled with vegetable soup while the comforting aroma of fresh bread, rosemary, cinnamon, and hot cider drifted through every corner of the warm stone building. Nobody assigned Olivia the work. She simply noticed what needed to be done and gently stepped in wherever another pair of hands might help. She kneaded bread beside elderly bakers, peeled apples with smiling children who eagerly shared stories about school, mended worn blankets for families arriving from distant villages, and somehow remembered every person's name after hearing it only once. Days slowly turned into weeks, and without realizing it, Olivia became as familiar to the people of Northvale as the church bells that echoed across the snowy rooftops each morning. One afternoon, while carrying baskets of fresh bread toward the community dining room, she noticed a little girl sitting alone beside the fireplace, quietly staring at an untouched bowl of soup. Olivia knelt beside her with the same gentle patience she had once offered frightened children during harvest festivals back in Mooncrest. "Is something wrong?" she asked softly. The little girl looked down at her worn boots before whispering, "I wanted to wait until my grandfather came home, but everyone says he has to keep working until tonight." Olivia smiled warmly and divided her own slice of fresh bread into 2 equal pieces. "Then perhaps we can save another bowl of soup for him, and you can make sure he does not miss dinner." The little girl's face brightened instantly. It was only a small gesture, yet nearby volunteers exchanged quiet smiles as though they had just witnessed something much greater. Olivia never tried to become important. She simply made people feel seen. That gift quietly spread throughout Northvale. Before long, merchants began leaving extra loaves of bread at the welcoming hall because they knew Olivia would always find someone who needed them. Farmers donated fresh vegetables after hearing how carefully she stretched every meal so that no family left hungry. Tailors delivered warm coats for children because Olivia remembered every birthday and every growing child who needed larger clothes before winter became harsher. She accepted every donation with sincere gratitude, always thanking the giver before thinking about herself. One snowy evening, the gray-haired woman who had first welcomed Olivia into Northvale gently placed a warm mug of cider into her hands. "Do you realize what has happened?" she asked with a knowing smile. Olivia looked around the busy hall where laughter mixed with the crackling fireplace and the cheerful sound of neighbors sharing supper together. "I only see people helping one another," she answered honestly. The older woman shook her head gently. "No. I see people helping because you reminded them how." Olivia lowered her eyes, humbled by the thought. She had arrived carrying nothing except a single trunk, an old quilt, and a heart that believed it no longer had a place in the world. Yet somewhere between baking bread, comforting strangers, and offering simple kindness without expecting anything in return, she had stopped feeling like an exile. She had quietly become part of the heartbeat of a kingdom that never once asked what she could not give, choosing instead to treasure everything she freely offered every single day. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Northvale, and with the first signs of early spring came longer days filled with laughter echoing through the town square. Snow melted into clear streams that wound between flower beds where children eagerly planted the first seeds of the season. Olivia welcomed every sunrise the same way she always had, tying her linen apron behind her back before stepping into the welcoming hall where fresh bread baked beside simmering soup. Yet something had quietly changed. She no longer felt like a visitor borrowing another kingdom's kindness. She belonged to the rhythm of the place as naturally as the church bells greeting each new morning. Shopkeepers greeted her by name before opening their doors. Farmers waved from wagons overflowing with vegetables. Bakers set aside the warmest loaf because they knew Olivia would deliver it to someone who needed encouragement more than food. The little carved wooden bird the young boy had given her rested on a nearby shelf beside the kitchen window, reminding her every day that one small act of compassion could change the direction of an entire life. One bright Saturday morning, the town gathered for the annual spring market. Colorful ribbons fluttered between wooden stalls displaying handmade quilts, fresh honey, carved furniture, flowers, and baskets filled with apples from the previous harvest. Musicians played cheerful melodies while children chased one another across the green beside the fountain. Olivia spent most of the morning helping elderly neighbors carry heavy baskets and guiding visitors toward local merchants instead of shopping for herself. She never realized how many grateful smiles quietly followed her through the crowd. Near noon, the mayor climbed onto the small wooden stage in the center of the square and gently tapped the microphone to gather everyone's attention. Conversation slowly faded until only birds singing from nearby maple trees could be heard. Every year, the mayor began with a warm smile. Our town recognizes someone whose kindness reminds us who we hope to become. Olivia continued arranging fresh flowers on a nearby table, assuming another respected volunteer would receive the honor as always. Then the mayor looked directly toward her. This year, Northvale wishes to thank the woman who arrived with almost nothing, yet somehow gave every one of us something greater than we knew we were missing. Olivia looked up in surprise as neighbors began applauding. Children smiled and waved enthusiastically. Elderly couples nodded with quiet affection. Farmers removed their hats. Bakers stepped away from their ovens. The gray-haired woman from the welcoming hall gently reached for Olivia's hand and encouraged her toward the stage. Olivia hesitated, overwhelmed by the unexpected attention. She had never served others hoping to be noticed. She simply believed kindness should never wait for permission. The mayor presented her with a simple wooden plaque carved by local craftsmen rather than an expensive metal. Across its polished surface were words that immediately filled Olivia's eyes with tears. Our home chose you. No royal title had ever touched her heart the way those 4 words did. They carried no expectation, no condition, and no hidden judgment. Only belonging. As applause filled the square once again, Olivia looked across the smiling faces surrounding her and realized that nobody here remembered her for what she had lost. They remembered how she listened, how she encouraged, how she shared, and how she quietly made every person feel important. Somewhere beyond the distant mountains, another kingdom still believed her greatest value had been measured by what she could never give. But here in Northvale, an entire community had already decided that the greatest gift she possessed had been her heart all along, and without realizing it, stories about the compassionate woman who transformed strangers into neighbors had already begun traveling far beyond the borders of the peaceful little kingdom. Spring gradually transformed into early summer, and Northvale seemed to bloom with a quiet confidence that reached far beyond its stone walls. Flower boxes overflowed with bright colors beneath every cottage window, children filled the streets with cheerful laughter from sunrise until dusk, and travelers increasingly chose the northern roads after hearing stories about the welcoming kingdom where strangers were greeted with warmth before questions. Olivia never noticed how often people spoke about her after she left a room. She remained focused on simple routines that had become the rhythm of her new life. Every morning she visited the welcoming hall before breakfast, every afternoon she helped organize meals and supplies for families in need, and every evening she walked through the town square, stopping to ask elderly neighbors how they were feeling or kneeling beside children proudly eager to show her their newest drawings and carved wooden toys. She remembered birthdays, celebrated small victories, and quietly listened whenever someone carried a burden too heavy to face alone. One sunny afternoon, a group of merchants arrived from neighboring territories with wagons filled with woven baskets, fresh fruit, fabrics, and handcrafted furniture. As they unloaded their goods into the busy marketplace, they quickly noticed something unusual. Every person they met seemed to know the same woman. Bakers waved when Olivia crossed the square. Farmers greeted her with baskets of strawberries. Schoolchildren ran toward her carrying wildflowers they had gathered that morning. Even visitors who had only stayed a few days smiled warmly after hearing stories about her kindness. One merchant finally turned to a local blacksmith and asked with genuine curiosity, "Who is she?" "We thought she was a member of the royal family." The blacksmith laughed softly while polishing a horseshoe. "She would probably be embarrassed to hear that. She is simply Olivia." Another merchant looked around the lively square in amazement. "Then why does everyone speak about her as though she belongs to all of you?" The blacksmith rested his hammer on the workbench and smiled thoughtfully. "Because she does." Those simple words quietly followed the traveling merchants long after they departed Northvale. At every village along the trade routes, they shared stories about the remarkable northern kingdom where a compassionate woman had transformed an ordinary welcoming hall into the heart of an entire community. They spoke about the volunteer who remembered every child's name, the baker who never allowed anyone to leave hungry, and the quiet stranger whose kindness had inspired neighbors to care more deeply for one another. Before long, the stories reached marketplaces, roadside inns, harvest festivals, and council gatherings across neighboring territories. People began referring to her with a name she had never chosen for herself. The White Omega of Northvale. Far to the south, inside the Grand Council chamber of Mooncrest Palace, advisors gathered around a polished oak table discussing trade reports delivered by merchants returning from the northern roads. One elderly council member unfolded a handwritten letter and paused before reading aloud. "There is a woman in Northvale whom every traveler remembers," he said carefully. "They say an entire kingdom has embraced her as family, and wherever she walks, people follow her example instead of her authority." Adrian Blackwood looked up from the documents before him. At first, he listened with polite interest. Then the council member quietly read the next sentence. "Her name is Olivia Bennet." The room fell completely silent. Adrian's silver eyes remained fixed upon the letter as though the words refused to make sense. Months had passed since he watched her carriage disappear beyond the palace gates, yet hearing her name spoken again awakened something he had carefully buried beneath duty and responsibility. He slowly reached for the report with steady hands, never imagining that a single story carried by grateful travelers would soon lead him toward the kingdom that had chosen the woman his own had allowed to leave. Early autumn arrived gently in Northvale, replacing the bright greens of summer with fields brushed in gold, amber, and crimson. Cool breezes carried the scent of ripe apples and freshly harvested wheat through the town, while church bells echoed peacefully across rooftops each morning. Olivia welcomed every new day the same way she always had, long before sunrise, helping prepare breakfast at the welcoming hall before visiting elderly neighbors who found the changing season more difficult than they cared to admit. She had learned where every lonely widow lived, which children secretly struggled to read, and which farmers quietly left part of every harvest for families facing difficult months ahead. She never asked to lead anyone. She simply noticed where kindness was needed first. One cool morning, thick fog rolled through the valley, delaying several supply wagons expected from nearby villages. By midday, travelers arriving at the welcoming hall explained that unusually early frost had damaged orchards farther east, leaving many families uncertain about the coming weeks. Olivia listened carefully before quietly gathering volunteers around the large wooden dining table. She spread a simple hand-drawn map across its surface and began marking every neighboring village that might need extra food before winter returned. "We still have healthy harvests here," she said gently. "If every household shares a little, nobody will have to face the cold alone." No speeches followed. No official orders were given. Instead, bakers immediately offered fresh bread. Farmers promised wagon loads of potatoes, squash, carrots, and apples. Tailors collected warm coats that children had outgrown. Carpenters repaired old carts so supplies could travel farther without breaking down. Before sunset, the welcoming hall had quietly transformed into a place where neighbors packed boxes, labeled blankets, and prepared meals for people they had never even met. Olivia moved from table to table with calm encouragement, thanking every volunteer by name and making certain nobody worked without resting or eating. Watching her, it became almost impossible to tell who had organized the effort and who had simply joined it. Everyone worked with the same purpose. A little boy carrying folded blankets looked up at his mother and whispered, "Miss Olivia makes helping feel easy." His mother smiled softly. "That is because she helps people remember they always wanted to help." Several traveling merchants preparing to leave Northvale paused beside the bustling hall, amazed by the quiet cooperation unfolding before them. One elderly trader shook his head with admiration. "I have visited kingdoms far wealthier than this," he murmured to his companion. "Very few understand that generosity multiplies when someone leads by example instead of command." The stories traveled once again, moving farther south with every wagon that crossed the mountains. Days later, inside the great library of Mooncrest Palace, Adrian Blackwood stood alone beside a tall window overlooking the royal gardens already touched by autumn. The latest trade reports rested unopened on the polished desk behind him. Yet one folded letter remained in his hands. He had read it so many times that the edges had begun to soften. It described a northern kingdom where harvest wagons left full and returned empty only because every crate had reached families who needed them most. It spoke of volunteers who followed the quiet guidance of a compassionate woman named Olivia Bennett. Adrian closed his eyes briefly as memories returned with painful clarity. He remembered her organizing winter festivals, comforting grieving families, and quietly placing others before herself long before anyone noticed. For the first time since watching her carriage disappear beyond the palace gates, he no longer wondered whether she had survived. He wondered whether his kingdom had lost the one person who had quietly held its heart together all along. The decision came quietly, almost unnoticed by everyone except the man who carried it. Before sunrise the following morning, Adrian Blackwood stood alone on the eastern balcony of Mooncrest Palace while a cool autumn breeze carried crimson leaves across the marble courtyard below. The kingdom was already beginning to wake. Stable hands prepared horses, servants opened tall windows to welcome fresh morning air, and palace bells echoed gently across the valley. Yet Adrian remained perfectly still, his silver eyes fixed on the distant northern mountains barely visible beyond the morning mist. For months he had buried every thought of Olivia beneath reports, ceremonies, and responsibilities, convincing himself that duty had required the choice he made. Now every letter arriving from Northvale quietly dismantled that certainty piece by piece. None of the reports praised wealth, military strength, or political influence. Every story spoke about one woman who remembered lonely neighbors, welcomed strangers before asking questions, and somehow transformed ordinary kindness into the foundation of an entire community. Adrian slowly unfolded the latest handwritten report once more. Near the bottom, one sentence had been underlined by the traveling merchant who delivered it. She does not rule the people. She reminds them to care for one another. Adrian closed his eyes for a long moment. He remembered winter festivals where Olivia had quietly slipped away from royal banquets to serve food beside volunteers. He remembered how children always ran toward her first during village visits, while elderly couples waited patiently just to thank her for remembering their names. None of those memories had ever seemed remarkable while she stood beside him every day. Only after she disappeared did he realize how many invisible threads she had been holding together. A gentle knock interrupted the silence. His oldest advisor stepped onto the balcony carrying several official documents. "Your Majesty," he said respectfully, "the council is waiting to discuss the eastern trade routes." Adrian accepted the papers but never looked down at them. "Postpone the meeting until tomorrow." The advisor hesitated in surprise. "Tomorrow?" Adrian nodded calmly. "I have somewhere I need to go." Within the hour, the palace courtyard filled with quiet activity. Stable workers prepared a single dark horse while attendants brought a simple traveling cloak instead of ceremonial robes. Several commanders approached, assuming they would organize a royal escort. Adrian thanked them politely before shaking his head. "No soldiers." One commander looked confused. "Your Majesty, the northern roads can be unpredictable." Adrian fastened the cloak around his shoulders himself. "This is not a royal visit." He paused before speaking again, his voice carrying unusual honesty. "It is a personal journey." The courtyard fell respectfully silent. No one argued. They simply watched as their king chose simplicity over ceremony for the first time in many years. Far away in Northvale, Olivia spent the same morning arranging baskets of apples, bread, and preserves for families living in the surrounding hills before winter returned. Children gathered around the long wooden tables, laughing as they decorated thank you cards that would accompany each food basket. Olivia knelt beside them, helping one little girl tie a blue ribbon around a loaf of fresh bread. "Every gift should remind people they are remembered," she said with her familiar gentle smile. Outside the welcoming hall, colorful leaves drifted through warm sunlight while neighbors greeted one another by name, completely unaware that a lone rider had already crossed the southern border. Mile after mile, Adrian guided his horse toward the kingdom whose people had embraced the woman he had once believed he was setting free, never imagining that the greatest lesson of his reign was waiting for him at the end of that quiet autumn road. 3 days later, as the afternoon sun bathed Northvale in warm shades of amber and gold, a lone rider guided a dark horse across the old stone bridge leading into the kingdom. Adrian Blackwood wore a simple traveling cloak instead of royal attire, leaving behind every symbol of rank except the quiet dignity that could never be hidden. Fallen leaves drifted across the cobblestones while townspeople carried baskets filled with apples, pumpkins, and fresh bread through the lively streets. Nobody recognized him. To them, he was simply another traveler arriving before evening. Adrian welcomed the anonymity. For the first time in years, he wanted to see a place without announcing who he was. He tied his horse outside the welcoming hall after noticing laughter spilling through its open windows. The rich aroma of homemade soup, baked bread, cinnamon, and roasted vegetables drifted into the crisp autumn air. Curious voices mixed with cheerful conversation until the entire building seemed to breathe with quiet contentment. Adrian stepped inside and immediately paused. Long wooden tables filled the hall, surrounded by families, elderly neighbors, travelers, and children sharing supper together. Volunteers moved comfortably among them, pouring cider, serving warm bread, and making certain no empty bowl remained unnoticed. There were no reserved seats, no signs of privilege, and no visible difference between the wealthiest merchant and the newest traveler. Everyone simply belonged. Adrian slowly removed his gloves as he observed the room. Then he saw her. Olivia stood near the center of the hall wearing the same simple linen apron she always tied before beginning her day. A loose strand of auburn hair had escaped behind one ear while she knelt beside an elderly gentleman, carefully wrapping fresh bread inside a cloth before placing it into his basket. She smiled as she listened to his story, never glancing toward the busy room around her because she made every conversation feel as though it were the only one that mattered. A little boy hurried toward her carrying a broken wooden toy. Olivia accepted it with gentle curiosity before sitting beside him on a nearby bench. Together they examined the loose wheel until an older carpenter noticed them, smiled warmly, and walked over with a handful of simple tools. Within minutes the toy rolled across the floor again, and the child's delighted laughter filled the hall. Olivia clapped softly with genuine happiness, celebrating the little victory as though it were something extraordinary. Adrian remained motionless. No one had instructed the carpenter to help. No one had organized applause. Kindness simply flowed naturally from one person to another because someone had quietly taught an entire community how to notice one another. The gray-haired woman who had welcomed Olivia months earlier approached Adrian with a friendly smile and offered him a bowl of hot soup before asking only one question. "Have you eaten today?" Adrian accepted the bowl, almost startled by the simplicity of her concern. She did not ask where he came from or what title he carried. She only cared whether he was hungry. He thanked her sincerely before looking across the hall once more. Olivia was now helping children arrange flowers down the center of the tables while elderly couples laughed beside them. She moved through the room without authority, yet every person instinctively trusted her presence. In that quiet moment Adrian finally understood what every merchant had tried to describe. Mooncrest had once judged Olivia by the air she could not give. Northvale loved her because of the hope she gave away every single day. As he watched strangers smile simply because she had entered the room, the painful truth settled gently into his heart. He had not lost a queen because she failed her kingdom. He had lost the woman who had quietly become the heart of it. The evening settled gently over Northvale, wrapping the welcoming hall in the golden glow of lantern light as families slowly finished supper and children carried empty bowls toward the kitchen with cheerful determination. Olivia thanked each volunteer before gathering a basket filled with fresh bread for several elderly neighbors who preferred quiet evenings at home. As she stepped onto the front porch, the cool autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant fireplaces across the peaceful village. She paused for a moment, smiling at the familiar comfort of the place that had quietly become her home. Then she noticed a lone traveler standing beneath the old maple tree beside the stone pathway. His traveling cloak concealed much of his appearance, yet something about the calm way he stood felt strangely familiar. For a long heartbeat neither of them spoke. Adrian slowly lowered the hood from his cloak, allowing the warm lantern light to fall across his face. Olivia's gentle smile faded into quiet surprise. She did not step backward. She did not rush forward. She simply looked at him with calm eyes that carried neither resentment nor fear. Months earlier she had imagined this meeting 1,000 different ways, yet now that it had finally arrived, silence seemed kinder than any speech she could have prepared. Adrian took one careful step closer before stopping at a respectful distance. "Olivia," he said softly. Hearing her name spoken in his voice again awakened memories that no longer carried the sharp pain they once had. They felt distant now, like snow melting beneath the first warmth of spring. Olivia answered with the same grace she had always shown. "Welcome to Northvale." There was no accusation hidden within her words. Only simple hospitality offered to another traveler. Adrian lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back at her. "I have spent many miles thinking about what I should say if I ever saw you again." Olivia waited patiently. He drew one slow breath. "I believed I was protecting my kingdom." His voice remained steady, but quiet regret softened every word. "Instead, I failed the person who had protected it every day without asking for recognition." Olivia listened without interrupting. Around them, laughter drifted from inside the welcoming hall while someone began playing a gentle melody on an old piano. The peaceful sounds reminded both of them how different this place felt from the grand halls where duty had always spoken louder than compassion. Adrian continued, "Every road I traveled north taught me something I should have understood years ago. Your value was never measured by the air you could not give. It was measured by every life you quietly changed." Olivia looked toward the warmly lit windows where children were helping volunteers clear the supper tables. The little girl she had once comforted now happily carried bread to an elderly neighbor. A young farmer laughed as he repaired a loose chair before anyone needed to ask. Kindness had become part of the kingdom's ordinary rhythm. "They chose one another," Olivia said gently. "I only reminded them that they already knew how." Adrian nodded slowly. "And I never saw it until it was gone." For several moments neither of them spoke again. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Finally Adrian met her eyes once more. "Olivia, I came here to ask something I should have asked long before making decisions for both of us." His voice carried humility instead of authority. "Will you return to Mooncrest with me?" Olivia smiled with quiet warmth, not because the question pleased her, but because she finally understood how much courage it had taken him to ask. Olivia looked at Adrian for a long, peaceful moment while autumn leaves drifted gently between them, carried by a soft evening breeze that seemed determined to slow time itself. The warm light spilling from the welcoming hall touched the edges of her smile as laughter from children echoed quietly behind her. Once, hearing his question would have filled her heart with hope. Months ago she would have followed him anywhere simply because she believed love meant remaining beside someone no matter the cost. But the woman standing before him now was no longer the frightened Omega who had walked away from Mooncrest with only a single trunk and a broken heart. Northvale had not changed who she was. It had simply reminded her who she had always been. Olivia lowered her eyes for a brief moment before looking back at Adrian with the same gentle kindness that had first drawn people toward her wherever she went. "Thank you," she said softly. "Not because you asked me to return, but because you finally saw me." Adrian remained silent, understanding there was more she needed to say. Olivia glanced toward the welcoming hall where volunteers were lighting fresh lanterns beside the windows. The little girl she had once comforted now helped an elderly neighbor carry bread home, laughing proudly with every careful step. Nearby, the carpenter who had repaired a broken toy earlier that year was teaching another child how to sand a small wooden bird. Ordinary moments surrounded them, yet together they formed something extraordinary. "When I arrived here," Olivia continued, "I believed I had lost my purpose. I thought I had been left behind because I could not become the person everyone expected me to be." She rested one hand lightly over her heart. "Instead, I found people who never asked me to become someone else." Adrian followed her gaze toward the bustling hall, quietly watching neighbors care for one another without expecting praise or reward. For the first time in many years, he understood that a kingdom could become stronger through compassion just as surely as through tradition. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth before she even spoke her answer. Olivia smiled with quiet peace. Mooncrest will always be part of my story, she said gently. But Northvale became my home. Her words carried no bitterness. They were simply honest. Adrian lowered his head with genuine respect. Then I will not ask again. After a thoughtful silence, he reached into the pocket of his traveling coat and carefully placed the old silver ring upon the wooden railing beside the porch instead of offering it directly to her. It belongs to your past, he said quietly. Whether you keep it or leave it here should always be your choice. Olivia looked at the ring for a moment before gently covering it with the tiny carved wooden bird she still carried every day. The two small objects rested side by side beneath the warm lantern light, one representing the life that had released her, the other the kindness that had guided her forward. Behind them, the welcoming hall doors opened as neighbors called Olivia inside for the evening meal. They smiled warmly when they noticed the traveler standing beside her, greeting him with the same kindness they offered every guest. No one cared that he was a king. They only saw another person invited to share supper. Adrian smiled quietly, deeply moved by the simple welcome. As church bells echoed across the valley and stars slowly appeared above Northvale, he understood the greatest lesson of his reign. Power could command obedience, but only love could inspire belonging. Olivia turned toward the warm light waiting inside, her heart finally free of the weight she had carried for so long, and as she crossed the threshold surrounded by people who had chosen her exactly as she was, she realized that sometimes the road that begins with rejection leads to the only place that was ever truly meant to become home.